Everybody in Coldwater Bend knew the story before the girl ever stepped down off that wagon. They knew it the way folks know weather in their bones without proof. The vain man had killed his first wife, or buried her, or worse, and there were uglier words for worse that nobody said out loud in front of the church women. He lived alone past the dry wash where even the coyotes wouldn't den. He'd paid good money, real coin, gold, not scrip, for a wife sight unseen. And a man only does that, they whispered, when no woman in her right mind would have him for free. So when Ruth Calloway came west in a debt that wasn't hers, sold by a brother who couldn't look her in the eye, the whole town had already decided how her story ended. They figured she was walking into a monster's house. They figured we'd be digging a small, quiet grave by spring. What none of them figured, what I didn't figure, and I had a closer seat than most, was that the monster had a secret, and that the girl they'd written off as a dead woman walking would be the one to keep it. My name's a Saproot. I'm an old man now and I've outlived nearly everybody in this telling, but I was there. I saw what she did, and I've been carrying it 40 years, waiting for somebody to ask. So here, sit down. Let me tell you about the winter Ruth Vane chose to be. The first thing I noticed about the new bride was that she didn't cry. I'd hauled enough mail-order women up from the Tucson road to expect tears. Not weak ones, mind, frontier-bound women aren't weak. That's a lie told by men who never had to dig a well. But there's always a moment, usually when the town drops behind you and the country opens up flat and pitiless to the mountains, when the size of the mistake settles in. They cry then, just a little, quiet into a glove or a sleeve so the driver won't see. Ruth Calloway didn't. She sat up on that buckboard with her spine straight as a fence rail and watched the land come at us like she was memorizing it. 23 maybe. Brown hair gone copper at the ends from a sun she clearly wasn't used to. A traveling dress that had been good once and had been brushed and rebrushed since to hide that it wasn't good anymore. Hands folded. Knuckles white. That was the only tell, those white knuckles. The rest of her was iron. I drove the team because Eli Vane wouldn't come into town to fetch his own wife. That ought to tell you something about how it started. "You're not him," she said about an hour out. First words she'd offered. "No, ma'am, I work his stock. Name's Asa." "Asa," she tried it like a foreign coin. "Is he as bad as they say in town?" I'm a coward in the small ways most men are, so I did what cowards do. I told the truth sideways. Town says a lot of things. Town's bored and mean, and it's a long winter. She looked at me then, full on, gray eyes and something behind them doing arithmetic. "That's not an answer." "No," I admitted, "it's not." She faced front again. Her jaw worked once. "I didn't think it would be. I'll tell you a habit of mine, since it matters later. I keep a tally book. Little leather ledger I bought off a peddler in '79. And into it I scratch a mark for every day I survive out here, because survival in this country is the only achievement a man like me can be sure of. Some men pray. I count. That night, after I'd handed Ruth Calloway down at the Vane place and watched the door close on her, I made my mark, and underneath it I wrote 3 words I've never been able to explain. "Reckon she'll do." I didn't know her, had no business reckoning anything, but I'd watched her get down off that wagon, smell the smoke from the cabin chimney, look at the man waiting in the doorway and not flinch. And something in me, some old animal sense that's kept me breathing through Apache campaigns and cattle stampedes and one bad marriage of my own, said, "That one's not going in the ground come spring. That one's going to surprise everybody." Now let me tell you about the man, because the rumors had him 3/4 wrong, and that last quarter was the part that mattered. Eli Vane was big the way old trees are big, not showy, just there, taking up more space than seemed fair. Black beard going gray at the chin, a scar that ran from his left ear down under his collar, and nobody knew the story and nobody was fool enough to ask. He spoke maybe 40 words a day, and I caught most of them, being his only hand, and I can tell you a full third of those words were to the horses. He'd buried a wife. That part was true, and the town hung the rest of its hate on it. What the town didn't know What I didn't know for a good while was that the first Mrs. Vane had died of a fever that swept through 3 years back, and that Eli had ridden 40 miles in a January storm to fetch a doctor who wouldn't come because the patient was that Vane woman out past the wash, and a doctor's got a reputation to think of. She died waiting for help that decent men decided she didn't rate. So when folks called Eli a monster, they were half right and entirely backward. The country had made him one, but it made him the kind that doesn't bite, just stops trusting. He'd bought a wife the way you'd buy a horse you couldn't inspect, because he'd learned the hard way that this place doesn't give you the things you ask nicely for. You take, or you go without. Ruth Calloway walked into all of that with one carpetbag and a Bible and those white knuckles, and the first thing she said to her new husband, I had it from the man himself, months later, the one time I ever saw him near to laughing, the first thing she said was, I'll cook and I'll mend and I'll keep your house, but I sleep alone until I decide otherwise, and if you've a problem with that, you can take it up with the brother who sold me, because he kept your money and I didn't. And Eli Vane, monster of Coldwater Bend, terror of church gossip, looked at this iron-spined slip of a woman in his doorway and said, There's a bolt on the bedroom door. I put it there myself this morning. He'd made her a lock before she ever arrived. That's the man. Put that against everything the town believed and tell me who the monster was. The first month, I watched it the way you watch weather coming from the corner of your eye, pretending you're busy with something else. Ruth worked. Lord, she worked. She came out of a soft enough family, you could tell, but she had that quality some people have where they refuse to be bad at a thing twice. Burned the first 3 batches of biscuits. By the second week they were better than mine. She tore her hands bloody on the wash the first day and bound them and did it again the next. She didn't ask for help and she didn't ask for thanks, and slowly, without anybody deciding it, the Vane place started to feel less like a den and more like a house where people lived. But she was watching too. That's the thing nobody gave her credit for. The town thought they'd sent a lamb to the wolf, and the lamb was sitting quiet at the table cataloging every strange thing in the wolf's den, and there were strange things. The food, for one. I noticed it before she said anything because I do the supply runs. Eli Vane bought flour and beans and salt pork for a household of 8. There were 3 of us, him, her, me, and I bunked in the barn and ate light. The numbers didn't close. I'd been pretending not to notice the gap for 2 years because Eli paid fair and asked nothing of me but silence, and silence I can do. Ruth wasn't built for pretending. I came up to the house one evening at the end of that first month and heard them through the door. Not fighting. Eli didn't have a fight in him, just that stone quiet. Ruth's voice, low and even, the voice of a woman who's thought a thing through before saying it. You take food out past the wash 3 nights a week, she said. You think I don't hear the horse. I count, Mr. Vane. I count the larder same as I count everything. There's a person out there, more than one. Silence, long enough that I should have walked off and didn't. You'll want to be careful, Eli said finally, asking questions you don't want answered. I'm not afraid of your answers. You ought to be afraid of this one. And then, and I swear this on my tally book on 40 years of marks, Ruth Calloway said, I've been afraid every day since my brother shook hands with a stranger and pointed at me. I'm tired of it. I'd rather know the worst of you tonight than guess at it for the rest of my life. So tell me, who's out past the wash? I heard the chair scrape. I heard Eli Vane let out a breath like a man laying down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it had edges. Get your coat, he said. I'll show you, but once you've seen it, you're in it. There's no unseeing, you understand, whatever happens after you chose it tonight. I made my mark in the tally book extra deep that night. I had a feeling I'd want to remember the date. What was out past the wash was a family. I'll set it down plain, the way Ruth told it to me after, because I wasn't there for the seeing and I won't pretend I was. Eli took her out under a thin moon. the two of them on one horse because he wouldn't risk a second set of tracks, and he brought her to a fold in the rock, a mile past the dry wash where a spring still ran, and the canyon walls broke the wind. And in that fold, in a brush shelter built low and careful, were three people the United States Army had spent the better part of a year trying to kill or cage. An old man, his granddaughter maybe 20, and the girl's son, a boy of 6 with a cough that worried everyone who heard it. They were Chiricahua, survivors of the long wars that had finally guttered out the year before, when the last free bands were loaded onto trains east to Florida, to swamps and fevers, to a country that killed them as surely as any bullet, just slower. These three had run, got separated in the chaos, hid in the high country through a winter that should have finished them, and come down half-starved into the one stretch of ground a white man patrolled and protected for reasons that made no sense to anybody. The old man's name was Clee. The young woman was called Nye, that's how Ruth heard it anyway and what she called her ever after. The boy was Ton. And the reason Eli Vane fed them, hid them, lied to a whole county for them, was a thing he told Ruth that night in about a dozen words, because that's all he ever needed. Clee pulled my brother out of a river when we were boys, long before any of this. A man pays his debts. That was it. That was the whole monstrous secret of Coldwater Bend. Not murder. A debt of honor, 40 years old, that a stubborn man refused to let the world talk him out of. Ruth came back from that canyon a different woman. I saw it in the morning, something settled in her that hadn't been settled before. The town thought she was trapped. She just learned she was trusted, and there's a world of difference between those two things, and she knew which one she'd take. Here is where I have to tell you about the boy, Ton, because the boy is why everything that came after came after. That cough didn't get better. Through the spring it got worse, the wet rattling kind that an old man like me recognizes for what it is, the lungs filling, the body losing a slow argument with itself. Nye did everything a mother could. Eli brought what medicines a man can buy in a town that asks why. But the boy needed more than brush shelter doctoring, and everyone in that canyon knew it, and nobody could say the thing out loud. To save Ton, somebody had to bring a doctor to a hidden Apache child. In a county where the going rate for a live Apache was good money, and a dead one was nearly as good. Where the men who'd fought the wars were home now, bored and armed and looking for one last story to tell. It was Ruth who said it. Of course it was Ruth. "There's a doctor in Coldwater Bend," she said. We were all three at the table, her, Eli, me, because by then I was in it too. I'd let myself be brought in the way you let yourself be brought into anything that matters, one small choice at a time. Dr. Mabry. He's a drunk and a coward, but he's a real doctor. "He won't come," Eli said. Same as the last one didn't come for, he stopped. He didn't say her name, he never said the first wife's name. "He won't come for the boy," Ruth agreed, "but he'd come for me." The room went still. "No," Eli said. "He'd come for a rancher's wife took with a fever," she went on, like he hadn't spoken. "I send a in white-faced and scared, says his mistress is dying, says her fool husband won't fetch help, and I'm all the way out past the wash, Mabry comes. Greed or guilt or just to spite you, he comes. And once he's here, once he's looking at a sick child instead of an idea, maybe he's enough of a doctor to be a man about it." "And if he's not," Eli said, "if he rides back to town and tells what he saw, you know what comes out the wash road then? Riders. The boy hangs same as the rest of us. You hang, Ruth. They'd hang a white woman for this. Don't think they wouldn't to make the point. And this is the part I want you to hold on to, because it's the whole of who she was." Ruth didn't argue that the risk was small. She didn't tell a comforting lie. She sat there and she looked it dead in the face, the rope, the real and waiting rope, and she said, "I know what it costs. I'm telling you I'll pay it. There's a 6-year-old drowning in his own chest a mile from here, and I have a way to maybe stop it. I won't carry that boy's death just to keep my own neck. I came out here owned by a debt I didn't make. I'd rather die in one I chose." I've been to a lot of churches in my time, gentlemen, and I've never heard anything in one to match that." Eli Vane put his face in his hands. Big man, stone man. And his shoulders shook once. When he looked up his eyes were wet, and his voice came out wrecked. "My brother," he said, "the one Clee pulled from the river, he died at 20, fever. I always thought if I'd done more, found a doctor, fought harder." He shook his head. "I've spent my whole life paying a debt for a man I couldn't save. And now you're sitting at my table telling me you'll risk hanging for a child you've known 6 weeks. He laughed, a terrible broken sound. "What kind of woman did your brother sell me?" "A stubborn one," Ruth said, and for the first time since she'd come west she smiled at him, just a little. "You should have inspected the goods." We made the plan that night. I'd ride for Mabry at first light, white-faced and lying. Ruth would put herself in the fever bed for show, so there'd be truth enough in the lie to fool a drunk. Eli would move Clee and Nye into the rocks, out of sight, leaving only the boy, because you can't move a child who can't breathe. And because, Eli said, a doctor staring at a dying 6-year-old has got one less wall to climb than a doctor staring at 3 grown enemies. It was a good plan, careful, honest about its own danger. What we didn't plan for, what nobody could have planned for, was that Coldwater Bend had been watching the Vane place a good while longer than we knew. That the missing food, the supply runs that didn't add up, the lights past the wash, had been adding up in other ledgers besides mine. That a man named Hollis Crane, who'd lost a son in the wars and never lost the wanting to make somebody pay for it, had been sitting on his suspicions like a hen on an egg. And that the morning I rode out for the doctor, white-faced and lying, Hollis Crane and 4 other men were already saddling up on the far side of town with rifles and a length of new rope, having decided that today was the day they finally went and saw what the Vane devil was hiding out past the wash. I didn't know any of that. I made my mark in the tally book that morning the same as always. I should have made it deeper. I want to tell you it went clean. It didn't. I got to town, got my lie out, and Dr. Mabry, give the sorry drunk his due, went pale and got his bag and got his buggy, because even a coward will move for a white woman dying, and that tells you everything about the arithmetic of this country, and I'll let it sit there ugly because it should. We were maybe 2 miles out the wash road when we heard the shots. Not many, 3, spaced out, the kind of shooting men do when they've got a thing cornered and aren't in a hurry. My blood went to water. I put my heels to the horse and left the doctor's buggy behind and rode like the devil himself, and I came up over the rise above the Vane place and saw it all laid out below me like the worst kind of painting. 5 horses in the yard, Hollis Crane's men, dismounted, rifles up, the cabin door hanging open. Eli Vane was down on one knee in the dirt with blood on his shirt, alive. I could see him moving but hit. And standing between the guns and the open door, between Hollis Crane and the inside of that house where a sick child lay, was Ruth. She had Eli's shotgun. She had it leveled. And she was talking, low and steady, the way she'd talked to me that first day on the wagon, and even from the rise I could see her knuckles were white on the stock and her voice never shook. I got down there. I'll spare you the part where I nearly didn't make it, old man, old horse. I came in at the back and crept up along the cabin wall with my own pistol out and my heart going like a hammer. This is what I heard. "Hollis Crane, step aside, Mrs. Vane, we know what's in there. You don't want to hang for a savage, you're white. You're a victim here, same as anybody. This man took you in a debt, he dragged you into his sin, you step aside and you walk away clean. Nobody'll say a word against you. You go on back east, you put this whole nightmare behind you." And there it was, the out, the clean door swinging open. Everything the town had decided about her, poor trapped Mrs. Vane, the monster's victim, handed to her on a plate, true enough to take, and all she had to do was step left and let them go through that door. You know already what she did. I told you at the start what kind of woman she was, but I want you to hear how she said it. She didn't make a speech. She'd already made her speech that night at the table, and she wasn't a woman who repeated herself. "There's a child in there," Ruth said. "He's 6. He can't breathe. The doctor's 2 minutes behind me on this road coming to help him because I sent for him. So you've got a choice, Mr. Crane. You can put a hole in me to get to a dying little boy. You can do that. I won't be able to stop all 5 of you. But you'll have to do it in front of God and Dr. Mabry both, and you'll have to live the rest of your life as the man who shot an unarmed—" She stopped, corrected herself, because Ruth never lied even to win, "as the man who shot a woman dead to get at a sick child. That's your story now. That's what you'll be in this town forever. I'm offering you a different one. Lower the guns. Let the doctor in. And we all of us find out we were better than this day." Nobody moved. I had my pistol on Holly's Crane's back. I'd have used it. God forgive me, I'd have shot a man in the spine to keep that door, and I've made my peace with that, and I haven't both for 40 years. What broke it wasn't me. It wasn't Ruth even. It was Eli Vane, down in the dirt and bleeding, who said, into all that silence, in his stone-quiet voice gone thin with the wound, "Holly's your boy, the one you lost, a breath. Clee's people, the old man inside, they buried more of their children this past 2 years than your whole town's lost in its history. You want to know what hatting us got them? Florida, swamps, their bobbies in the ground. Another breath worse. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm asking you to be a father for 10 more seconds. There's a boy in there. Be the man your son would have grown up to be." I have thought about those words every day of my life. Holly's Crane lowered his rifle. Just him at first. Then, one by one, like ice going off a pond, the other 4. And into that impossible, that undeserved mercy, came the rattle of Dr. Mabry's buggy over the rise, and the drunk coward climbed down with his bag and looked at 5 armed men and a bleeding rancher, and a woman with a shotgun and a cabin door standing open. And he said the only useful thing he ever said in his life. "Somebody going to tell me where the patient is, or are we all just going to stand here?" The boy lived. I'll give you that much clean because the rest isn't, and you've earned one clean thing. Mabry doctored Ton, then Eli in that order, because Ruth stood over him and made sure of the order. The boy's cough broke 3 days later. He grew up. I'll come back to that. But you don't get the rest clean. Holly's Crane kept his mouth shut, and so did his 4 men, because there's no version of that day they could tell in town that didn't make them the men who almost shot a woman over a sick child, and shame is a better lock than any honor. But the secret was out now, in the worst way known, and held by men who hated it. It couldn't last. Eli knew it. Ruth knew it. Clee Nye and the boy stayed through that summer healing, and in the fall, when the boy was strong enough to ride and the passes north were still open, Eli took them out one night and didn't say where. Mexico, I always figured. There were free Apache bands holding on down in the Sierra Madre, and a man who'd run that far might find his own. He was gone 11 days. He came back alone, and he never spoke of it, and neither did Ruth, and neither did I. The debt was paid. Clee had pulled a Vane boy from a river 40 years gone, and a Vane had carried Clee's grandson and great-grandson to safety 40 years on, and somewhere in there is the only kind of justice this country ever managed, too small, too late, and bought too dear, but real. Eli Vane lived 9 more years. The wound from that day never fully let him be. He walked stiff after, and the winters were hard on him. He and Ruth, well, that bolt on the bedroom door. She told me once, the only time she ever spoke of it, that she'd thrown it open herself, the spring after the boy lived, and that it had been her choosing and nobody else's, the way everything in her life out here had finally become her choosing. They had 2 daughters. The town came around the way towns do, slow and never quite admitting it was wrong. And by the end, the same church women who'd predicted her spring grave were bringing her preserves and calling her dear. She let them. Ruth wasn't one to hold a grudge past its use, but I noticed she never quite trusted the preserves. I'm near the end now, and I find I don't want to finish, the way you don't want to finish anything you've loved. The boy Ton, I said I'd come back to him. I'm an old man, and the males are strange things, and the world's gotten bigger and smaller at once. But 4 years ago, after all this time, a letter came to me, forwarded and re-forwarded, soft with handling, from a man in Mexico who taught himself to write English late in life. He'd spent some years tracking down where the people who'd hidden his family had ended up. He had questions only an old ranch hand could answer. He signed it with a name I didn't know, and then, below it in careful letters, the name his mother used to call him. He's a grandfather himself now. He named one of his own grandsons after a man he barely remembered, a big quiet rancher who carried him out of the dark. And he wanted to know, he wrote, whether there'd been a woman there too, a white woman. He had only a child's flickering memory of her, he said. A voice that didn't shake, someone standing in a doorway. He wanted to know her name. He wanted to teach it to his grandchildren so it wouldn't be lost. I sat a long while with that letter. Then I got out my tally book, the same one, 40 years of marks, the leather gone black with handling, and I turned to the very first page, to that line I'd written the night I drove a straight-backed girl out to a monster's house and couldn't say why I'd written it.